Advisor was Esther Goody.
That's right, yes.
I thought you were trying to get away from West Africa.
Good. That was a good point. Oh, but of course, in getting away, one can then be very happy to also to have connections.
Tell me about Esther.
No, she actually, I remember more as an undergraduate supervisor. I used to go round to the house on
Shelley Row.
Shelley Row, that's right. And the children were little. And I remember supervisions there, and I still remember the first essay I wrote for her in my prelims year. And it was such a leap forward from what I'd been doing in part one. And I was just so excited, and I remember going to, I was in bliss, I went to the university library, and the question was taking Durkheim's method in suicide, how using other materials could you in fact argue or make an argument for the presence of social facts. In other words, she was requiring one to think through different materials in order to actually focus on the method and procedure of inquiry. And I was just thrilled to bits with it. I never gave my students half as imaginative titles, I don't think. But she was a wonderful undergraduate supervisor. As a PhD supervisor, I don't know whether it was customary then, but it was fairly hands-off. One was left very much to one's own devices, although she steered and guided as much as she wished, I'm sure. But I was also appointed a field supervisor, Paula Brown.
Oh yes.
Who was in Canberra at that point at ANU. And in fact she was field supervisor to both of us. And so Paula obviously took the place of supervision in the field.
So there was an extensive pre-field work training course that you went through at that time?
I was married in July and we set sail in November or December? November? Yeah.
So
Andrew had waited that year, so he must have occupied himself in that pre-field year, but I recall that it was reading and preparations and personal preparations for Papua New Guinea.
Nothing on methodology, really. No. And what was the subject of your research? I'm asking you questions to which I know some of the answers, but for the wider world, what were you setting out to investigate?
Well, this was where the West African roots showed themselves, because Esther was interested in sibling order and the effects of sibling order on achievement, and being firstborn or secondborn or whatever. And I thought that I would investigate this in relation to cash crops, because I knew that coffee had been introduced into, well, of course, pitching up in Hagen itself and realising that coffee indeed this was 1964, coffee was getting off the ground, but wasn't very widely, it was grown, but it was, hardly embedded in local practices. And sibling order was a non-starter. It was just not a way in which people thought about they could differentiate older and younger, but it wasn't an organisational principle. But that didn't matter. It was a good topic to get me there. And once there, of course, I studied what was in front of my eyes. Yeah.
Do you remember the first arrival in a village or where you mainly worked?
Well, we were both very naive, and luckily it took quite some time to get to the final place where we were going to have a house built. I do remember travelling up from Port Moresby in small, very small plane. I don't know whether it was as small as a Cessna, but it was a very light aircraft that actually landed at all the airstrips along the Wadi Valley, and the one just before Mount Hagen. I mean, these are no longer functional airstrips. The one just before Mount Hagen was called Bantz. And as we got out, somebody said, Bantz. And I thought, I've heard a prenasalized B. I thought. And then actually landing on the airstrip in Mount Hagen, because it was very close to the town at that point, and seeing people with bark belts and tankets, which is a kind of corduline bustles. And these are just like pictures out of Vijender and Tishner, and that was a romantic moment. But we took some time to get up to the eventual place where we had a houseboat, which was a good thing, because we left behind us a trail of mismanaged relations and broken intentions and so on and so forth. So it was quite a process before we finally really settled.
And what was the fieldwork like? I mean, it's a big subject, but dramatic, fascinating, lonely?
The place was spectacularly beautiful. You get up in the morning, and in fact we chose the place I think because it was so beautiful, on a ridge, and there were two drainage systems, one valley on one side and one on the other. The hills, the tops of the hills and mountains were wooded. People planted fallow after their gardens anyway, so the area was quite wooded and quite steep. You were always going up or down. There was very little flat land, but it was beautiful, and that actually had an effect. I don't think I ever stopped feeling grateful that I was there. Managing relationships was fraught, tense making. For a while I was by myself because we thought we had different PhDs to get from this work, and Andrew went off in one direction, I went off in another. I pitched a tent, well I didn't not pitch a tent, had a house built much closer to Hagen town, a place called Kellower, and I was there by myself. That was quite lonely, for 2 or 3 months, and the tension manifested itself in indigestion. And after the evening meal, which and perhaps that was a fault, I would allow myself the period of the evening meal, about an hour, to sort of withdraw and have a bit of time to myself. But it would invariably end with me lying on my camp bed on my stomach to try and get rid of indigestion.
What were you eating? Yeah, maybe that didn't help. You weren't eating some indigestible substance?
No, I don't think so. No, it was because I was
tensed up.
I was tense, and actually removing myself probably increased the tension rather than reduced it. But at any event, at the original field site, which is a place called Hamburg, we had a sort of open kitchen, and people would, we put money into the cash economy by buying food, and we always had more food than we could eat, so we had a sort of open kitchen for people who came and sort of ate with us and so forth. I loved walking, and I loved setting off to see people, but of course people don't live in villages. Everybody has their own homestead, so the chances are you would pitch up at somebody's house and they wouldn't be there either. I mean, they'd gone off and visited somewhere, so it's quite frustrating in some ways. But managing the demands that were made was quite difficult. I know I loved it.
and what came out of it. I mean, if you'd like to give a simple précis of perhaps one of your
very quickly. One of the things that was going on very publicly, this was 64, 65, were local courts, dispute settlement arenas. And these local courts were heard, sorry, little L, not the Institute of Local Court that came along later. These sessions were held by people who called themselves either council, after councillor, or committee, which was a name they obviously borrowed from committee, but labelled a person committee. And these happened with great frequency, would attract a small sort of public sitting around, and many of them involved women. And many times women were being accused, usually in some form of disloyalty, running away, wanting a divorce, and so forth. And it was a very persistent phenomenon. So I gradually began to build up the idea of a research thesis based on the instance of divorce in relation to dissent groups, solidarity. And this, you may remember, was Gluckman and the Zulu, and this was straight 1960s Cambridge social anthropology with union dissent groups and the fragility or otherwise of conjugal relations. And Esther obviously thought that was a good idea. So I set about trying to put things on a statistical basis. So I did a complete, not trusting my ability to sample, I did a complete count of marriages according to people's life histories within the set of clans that we were most closely associated with, and recorded marriages and deaths and widowhood, obviously remarriages, had to make a decision as to what was and wasn't a marriage, of course. I mean, that comes prior. And had with me John Barnes's formula for working out divorce rates, and also had with me an early piece by Richard Salisbury, by Bulmer, I think, and by Murray Ray, who all worked in the Highlands, and had some sense of the marriage rates in other societies, and assumed that my thesis was going to be about the high rate of divorce as against the strength of the union dissent group. It took me a couple of months to complete this survey, which of course was very interesting because one learns an awful lot of other things as well, and then to compute it, and then to try to use Barnes's different types of divorce rates to work out some kind of something on which I could make a statement. Very pleased that I was doing a little bit of statistics, because I had wept over the counting machines in statistics in part 2. I wept, I mean wet tears dropped on these counting machines. You know. And when I did, the results were completely uninteresting. I mean, just not interesting. Then I suddenly realised the phenomenon I had been observing. I had not been observing a high divorce rate, or indeed particular anxiety about divorce. I had been observing what I later learned to call gender ideology. I had been observing the fact that women, going from one clan to another in marriage, of course, have to be blamed for what goes wrong between the clans. I mean, it's a structural dynamic, if you like. And that was the beginnings of my interest in gender relations, although of course it wasn't called gender then. One had to talk in terms of sex roles, or relations between the sexes. Women in Between, published in I mean, I've said this elsewhere, I don't need to repeat
No,
it.
we do. No,
Women in Between, published in 1972, it doesn't have the word gender in it.
Hmm.
I first came across that term, actually the year before, I think it was 71 or 72, in a book by Anne Oakley. But that's what it was. I mean, that was the start of my interest in male-female relations.
Mm.
What became gender issues.
Mm. What was the core of the argument of women in between, or?
Women in Between was really an assessment rather than an argument. An assessment of how one might think about including women in a description of social life. When you were dealing with the lineaments of society that quite clearly privileged men in terms of their membership of groups, their activity in ceremonial exchange, their prominence in warfare, and all the rest of it, yet where crucially men and clans depended upon women. I mean, men even depended on women for display, and one of the great problems I think men had is that in their displays and all their finery, who were they displaying to? You know, they were displaying to women who weren't worthy of the display, and there were all kinds of dynamics like that. And you were dealing with women who half believed what men said, but only half believed, and actually, although circumscribed, led lives of their own, and had ways of dealing with things. So it was less an argument, more an adjudication, I think, and more of a how do you set about describing a situation like that.
And moving on to another of your famous books, with a nice title, Vijender the Gift. Was that related to this theme, or was that an entirely different kind of either description or argument?
Well, the Vijender of the Gift really, in a way, unwrote Women in Between. Women in Between had been very much concerned with social dynamics, perhaps one can put it. But even when it came out, it was already theoretically, well, let's put it this way, it was very much of its time. And in the intervening years, with the whole wave of post-structuralist critique and ways of thinking about ideology, to which Edmund, of course, may have had a contribution, to ways of thinking about ideology, with the emergence of Marxist anthropology, with the emergence of a feminist anthropology that included recourse to literary studies and a whole range of other humanities disciplines. Quite clearly the kind of description that I produced for Women in Between simply wasn't adequate. And the Vijender of the Gift was an attempt to rewrite the basis upon which I had produced Women in Between. It doesn't go about proclaiming that is the case, but that was always in my mind. What it does is survey a lot of the literature across Papua New Guinea, and it draws on a whole area. I mean, some it neglects, but it draws on several areas across Papua New Guinea, and attempts to come to attempts to work through a mode of description that was, to my mind, the solution to certain problems in gender analysis. Sometimes, people say, "Oh, what is the individual?" Or, what do you mean by indirect and direct exchange, and so forth? Would you define it? And my response has to be, it's not the definition that matters, it's what is the problem to which that was the answer. And the problems to which the second part of the Vijender the Gift is the answer were there in the first part. And there are 4 chapters, chapters 3 to 6. And one by one, they take up different aspects of what was then quite hotly debated in the feminist literature. Takes up aspects of economics and labour and exploitation. It takes up public and domestic domains and prominence in politics. It takes up ritual and so forth. And I worked through what for other Papua New Guinea societies had to up to that point. We're talking about 1984 was when I began that book. What up to 1984, 85, had to that point been the outcome of feminist-inflected attention to New Guinea materials. And each one of these results in an impasse. I mean, you get so far and you can't get any further, and there are problems. So I then bundle all those problems up, and I say, haha, it's to do with the way people are thinking about gender and gender identity. And I found a term for it, which was that they're treating gender as a possession, as something that people have or don't have, or whatever. No, everybody has gender, but depending which one. And that seemed to me typical of a particular way of dividing up the world and thinking about the world that I thought could be solved by suggesting, if that's commodity logic, then let me use gift logic to think about the Melanesian. Now, I've been tripped up so many times on having used this antonym, but the terms really are irrelevant. The point is it released me. It enabled me to put all those arguments. You know, those arguments had done their work. They brought me up to a certain point, but they'd done their work. And it enabled me to then go on and develop a schema for thinking about Melanesian societies and their theories of social action and so forth. So that's what that book's about.
You mentioned the term individual, and as someone who's worked on individualism, I'd be very curious to know what you mean by it and how it impinges on the concept that the West have individuals, and how that is different from what you found in PNG.
Yeah. The circumstances under which people individuate themselves or individuate elements in the world around them have to be contrived. One of the things that clans do as groups is insist on their individuality through putting on spectacles, through dancing, claiming identity and so forth. So it's not the case that there are no individuals. On the contrary, individuation is an aspect of what they're doing, but it's not taken for granted. Whereas I think in the world you and I know best, we take the individuality of items as the sort of, and of persons, as sort of grounding nature, and all our efforts are to think about the relations between them. So we're constantly talking about relations between entities, whether we're building political structures or writing an essay or whatever it is we do. Because the entities are somehow in their individuating aspect prior. Well, it seemed to me it was in the Melanesian material, and here I was quite guided by the invention of culture, Roy Wagner's work. It seemed to me it was very much the other way around, that individuation was an achievement. So the big man, the individual big man was absolutely the achiever, which was what big manship was about. And that what that was cut out of, or what that came from, was state of non-individuation, which took a very particular form if you're thinking about persons, because persons are always divided. They are divided by their substance, by their physical, in their bodies. They're divided by their loyalties and so forth, between their mother's side and their father's side. And although these have unequal weight in social organisation, in terms of the way persons imagine themselves, they are forever divided, and that division is constantly repeated. So that when somebody marries, they as it were have to dispense. I mean, if we're talking from a man's point of view, when a man marries, he dispenses with the feminine side of himself that he was born with, in order to meet his wife and create another dualism, if you like. So that, you know, at the most intimate level, we're talking about division as a social imperative. So husband and wife sitting across a hearth, you know, pigs grunting in the background, the most intimate domestic scene. These people are divided radically by their origins, and that radical division will be there in the children they produce, and so forth. I borrowed individual from Marriott in India, simply as a way of talking about how people are imagined as always composed of distinct entities. That was
Fascinating. You've written quite a lot of books. Do you enjoy writing, and how do you write?
Well, I was going to, before you began your questions, because I thought this encounter might be very different from what it has so nicely been. I thought I was going to actually preface my remarks by saying I've had several interviews recently and have come to the realization that actually talking is a completely different activity from writing, and that when I'm asked to talk about what I write, I fail. I fail over and over again. Now, some people can do it, some people can't. A bit like when I had my portrait painted at Girton, the painter, Daphne Todd, lovely person, painted by colour, used a very tiny paintbrush, hardly drew an outline, but simply observed the colour, simply observed colours in relation to one another, and gradually crept over the whole canvas like this. And I said brightly to her, "Oh, that's just like writing," I said, "you know, the words, you know, little words, but they all matter, and they all take their colour from one another." And she would have none of it, and she said, "That's just academic, it's just academic balderdash, I mean, that's just nonsense. I paint what I see," she said. Now, that was somebody who couldn't put in words what they painted, whereas other people can. We had another artist, we have a collection in Girton of people's portraits, and we had another artist come and expound his portrait, and he was most eloquent. So some people can. Well, in the same relation to painting, writing is such an important activity of mine, and has such a distinct part in my life. I cannot actually represent what I write just in terms of talking. It doesn't work. And by coming to that realization after having done some terrible interviews, and it's partly to cheer me up, of course, but I actually think talking and writing are quite distinct genres.
But just on the practical side, I mean, do you write on a computer? Do you write by hand? Do you find your best ideas come when you're writing, or when you go off for a break and have a walk away from your writing? That sort of thing.
Of course, I began like everybody else writing longhand, and then using a mechanical typewriter, and then getting onto a computer. And that's actually relevant, because for many years the typing would come as a kind of, at a point where the writing was already quite well developed. So it was always a polishing activity, and had the pleasure of sub-editing, the pleasure of that polishing. And that somehow is retained even when I don't no longer do those pre-typing stages. Somehow it still carries the sense that I'm doing something that's nearer to completion than writing. What I usually do is, well, no, I'll start in another place. Very often, before I write something, I fall into a sort of depression. I feel I've got nothing to say, or everything's been said, or I'm stupid, or I can't think what to say. And this actually was a real crisis at the time of writing my inaugural lecture. I remember that was in October, and I remember the August that I'd given myself to write it, and halfway through August it was just in complete despair because I couldn't think of anything. And that, I mean, it can be a day or two, but it can also be much longer. It also can be a much longer period. And the writing then becomes a process of lifting myself out of that period, out of that moment. So it actually has quite an emotional effect, and I can't fake it. I mean, if I have something to write, I can't fake being depressed because I need to write. It doesn't work like that. It's either a real downer, or it doesn't, or not at all. Anyway, when I write, I very often write very fast and very carelessly over the whole span of more or less of what I want to do, and the ideas all come very quickly. That is then followed by a quite pleasurable period when I do the real work, which is going over what I've written and actually assessing whether any of this is any good and what can be retained and what needs to be discarded. And I mean, that's where the scholarship comes in. And I'm doing all this. I mean, I might write a few notes just to guide me, and I've quite often, depends how long the piece is, for book length obviously, but even for a shorter piece I may well do a little schema beforehand, or else I do a schema after I've done this first bit. That gives me my schema, and I then know roughly, I mean visually, I know roughly where things are going to appear. But then there's this long process of correction, and of course it's like, finding caterpillars in the salad. You don't know what you've swallowed in the first one. You don't know what you've missed. You don't know what still needs to be corrected. But that in the end tends to, you tend finally to get to a point beyond which you just stop correcting. That's how I look.
Fascinating. Let's talk about it at length elsewhere, but just to come back to one other large chunk of your work, which is your work in this country, and particularly your more recent work, which is many of the people who watch this will want to hear a little bit about your interest in institutions and in bureaucracy, accountancy, and so on. How did you get interested in that, and what is that work?
That really began at Manchester, when I was head of department, and I went in 1995, and then 1996 was the first of the really big RAEs. 1986, sorry, 85, 86. And 86, the first of the big research assessment exercises. I was quite oppressed by it, but at the same time, because of the position I was in, if I hadn't been head of department, I don't think anything of this, but because I was head of department, and therefore responsible for having these people perform well, and wanted them to, I had to do everything I could to encourage them, while at the same time being highly sceptical of the exercise. And out of that grew the idea, well, how can I make sense of what I don't like? Maybe if I study it a bit seriously, at least I can make it interesting. So it came actually out of absolutely direct, hands-on institutional experience. I think that also meant that I remained naive in the sense that I didn't have the knowledge or the facilities to put things into a historical or political perspective as people from other disciplines might have, and I was always driven by a sense that criticism was what this issue, and I think that was a bit naive. But I've been really taken aback at the extent to which the few pieces I've written on audit have been picked up all over the place and across many disciplines. Extraordinary.
How would you account for it? Yeah.
I just think not so many people were writing at that point on these issues. I was drawing in higher education in a very direct way. I think it just spoke to people's concerns.
In a recent piece you wrote for, I think, to be published in Cambridge Anthropology, which was a reply to something I wrote.
That's right.
You put forward the, as usual, counter-intuitive argument that there wasn't enough bureaucracy in the post of head of department of social anthropology and so on. Can you explain what you were arguing there?
I was following a particular writer who laments the demise of the Oldstyle civil service and of the notion of a bureaucracy as a service order within government distinct from politics. And what is being lamented is the personalisation of administrators, the extent to which civil servants these days are meant to have ownership of their projects, are supposed to be very much personally involved and so forth. So that what is regretted is not bureaucracy per se, but this very particular form of understanding in the civil service, that there were procedures and principles that, as it were, saved one from the effects of too much personal investment in what was going on. That is, but one of the things I do mention there is that some of the functions of that old style bureaucracy you find not these days in bureaucrats, but in some of the techniques they surround themselves with. So one of our problems in the current era, when we feel oppressed by what we might call bureaucracy, is not so much the activities of individuals, but it is the kinds of programs that are set up that we have to conform to. So, for example, the head of department has constant sort of pro forma things to be filled in, where only certain answers to questions will do, because otherwise the machine just throws them out or whatever. And I think this is a new. Well, one shouldn't be evaluative about it, I'm sure, but it's certainly a new way of dealing with process and procedure.
Let's turn to a more cheerful subject. You mentioned the painting of you, and I know that although music doesn't seem to be very important to you, you did write a book about body art in Highland New Guinea, and so obviously aesthetic things and painting has meant a lot to you.
No, indeed. My mother would take me round art galleries. Yes, no, I got some training in.
But how do you come to write the book on New Guinea body painting and art? Was that a side issue when you were doing your PhD?
That was a joint book, of course. The first and last. It was quite difficult to do jointly. Peter Ucko, University College.
Yes.
Was starting up a series on art. James Farris wrote on Niebuhr, for example. And basically commissioned us to do it. And I actually, in 1967, undertook some fieldwork dedicated to photographing aspects of people's decorations.
We've only got 20 minutes to go, and there's so much more, but I'd like to just touch on some of your institutional activities. Talking about art reminded me, of course, that you were assistant curator of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. How long was that for, and when was that?
Well, I mean, this is a sign of how things were. I received a letter while still in the field, saying, this was Geoffrey Bushnell saying, when I returned, I'm not sure who the letter was from. It was from Maya. Would I be interested in the post of assistant curator? So I said yes. So immediately on return from the field, I took up that position, and the arrangement was that I would be in the museum 4 days a week and would write my thesis 3 days a week. And that was very good training. I mean, I only have had 3 days a week to write, so it meant I used those 3 days.
Do you enjoy being curator?
I did. I was given quite a free hand, and remember in particular enjoying revamping the New Guinea collections, which are quite notable. I did, but the reason I hesitated is because actually the best memory I have is sitting in the office, and the office had the afternoon sun, and just feeling tired of, I'm afraid, questions from all kinds of people, because it meant, I mean, this was in the days before email, but I think it was a kind of pre-email moment, if you can, piles, there were always questions, and however many, and one was happy to do it, clearly, that's not the point. The point was, however many there were always more. And
all of us as email recipients will know the feeling. It's even worse now. You then went on, and there were other bits of your career. You were Director of Studies at Trinity, and you were Junior Research Fellow at Trinity, weren't you? Or were you not?
No, I was actually an official fellow.
It was Andrew who was at JRF at Trinity.
Andrew was at JRF, yes.
Yeah, that's right, one of the first in anthropology. And then you were an official fellow there. How did you enjoy Trinity?
Trinity were quite wonderful. This was much later. This was in the early 1980s. I had come back from a... Let me get the chronology right. I'd been at Girton. I was a Bi Fellow and an official fellow. I then went to Canberra for a period. It then became very obvious that I was going to need to divorce Andrew Strathern. I then returned. I'm just trying to take up the chronology. I then returned, and that was the time when I failed to get an assistant lectureship in the department. And then I returned, and that's right. Trinity made me an official fellow, but then Manchester asked if I'd be interested in going to Manchester as head of department. My first departmental job. And I knew that before I had actually been inducted into the Trinity Fellowship. So I said, look, I'm terribly sorry, but after a year I'm going to leave Cambridge and go to Manchester. And they said, never mind, we'll induct you anyway. So I was there for a year. So they behaved very, very handsomely. It's an impressive place, Trinity, whichever way you look at it.
And tell me something about your Manchester time. You were there from about 85 to 93.
85 to 93.
Yes. So.
No, that was a wonderful period of my life. I very much enjoyed being in Manchester and living there. The twins were little. Barbara hadn't finished her O-levels and stayed behind here in Cambridge for a while, and they came up later. No, I enjoyed that. I was an ageing person when I arrived. I was much younger when I left.
You had some good colleagues there.
I had some, of course the department was, I was the only woman in the department when I arrived. And I had some excellent colleagues there, and would have gone into some very...
The management structure there, I remember you telling me, was very different from Cambridge. I mean, basically you were the intermediary between the university, and so you go to a meeting, they'd tell you what you had to do, then you went back to the department and told them what they had to do, rather than bottom upwards and having to persuade the university what the department wanted to do. Is that roughly right, or slightly oversimplified?
Yes, there was a wider faculty. There was a wider social science faculty that, in effect, did a lot of the executive decisions. But that faculty was very much, a case of first of all, everybody was negotiating from the point of view of their own departments. But what Manchester did provide, which I really only realised when I came to Cambridge, was that I knew my steps to the Vice-Chancellor. I knew how, if I needed, if there was anything very desperate, I knew my steps and I knew how to go to the Dean and so on and so forth. So the structure was very clear. And there's not a great deal more to say about it, but it was very clear in those days. Yes.
And then you, this gives the point of contrast, you came to our department as William Wise Professor and found the chaotic rabble of hunter-gatherers that we are in Cambridge. You don't have to say whether you enjoyed it or not, but have you any reflections on your time as William Wise in the Department of Social Anthropology?
Well, of course, it was a wonderful department, and I hope still is. It took me 4 years before I stopped saying I I don't know my way around this university. And I'd been an undergraduate, I'd been a research student, I'd been here in my middle years as college by-fellow and then official fellow. But coming back, William Wise, and of course head of department, because I committed myself to 5 years, as you know. It took me a long time to feel comfortable again, and I think that's because, you know, the university is running at, well, you know, it's running in many epochs. You know, there's a monastic culture, and there's an 18th century coffee room culture, and there's a corridor culture, and there's 19th century entrepreneurialism, and there's 20th century management, and these things are all running simultaneously. It makes it a very complex place, and that sort of course keeps it creative. The complexity means there are all kinds of metaphorical corners and nooks and crannies and so forth that allow idiosyncratic procedures, or used to flourish. The department itself, I have to say that the liveliness of the students and especially the graduate students has remained a real joy, I think, one could say.
What about which kind of teaching do you enjoy most? It sounds as if it's the PhD supervisions. Do you like lecturing, supervising as well, or do you find that less appealing?
Yes, I enjoy lecturing. I never regarded myself as particularly good at it, and could never tell whether I was going to leave a lecture feeling elated or leave a lecture with my tail between my legs, and either could happen. And I never knew at the outset, and it seemed to have no relation on the amount of preparation I did, which it would be, but it could easily be one or the other. So, so that was rather mixed. Latterly, I should say that the writing up seminar really emerged as the piece of involvement with students, because they were sadly teaching. I mean, they were doing a lot of the work. That was really a sort of highlight of my teaching week. I used to enjoy that tremendously. Yeah.
And then the last sort of institutional role is Girton, the Mistress of Girton. Tell me about that great college and your enjoyment or not enjoyment of it. What's it like being Mistress? I warned you not to do it, I'm sure.
Yes, you did. You did, and I think probably you were quite wise.
But has it been good and interesting? And
well, I enjoy very much being part of a complicated institution, and just as it were, witnessing the way different parts of what is going on sort of work together, or indeed don't work together. There's an incredible team of people there in the form of the bursar, the senior tutor, and the secretary to council, and so forth, who do a lot of the day-to-day administration. I, of course, was only the part-time head of house, which means that much more of my administrative time has always gone on departmental or university matters, and I'm including in university matters, requests from other universities as well. Within college, something that I thought I wouldn't enjoy, I enjoy tremendously, and that is actually sitting down with roughly the same people 2 or 3 times a week to eat. I thought that would be a bit oppressive, but in fact it's turned out to be quite delightful. The college has a very good spirit about it. There are no. I mean, I always knew. I mean, I knew right from the outset in Manchester. The one thing you need to prevent is a cleavage. You can have any number of prima donnas, you can have any number of alliances and whatever, but as long as the alliances keep on, I mean, this is good old anthropology, as long as the alliances keep on cross-cutting with one another and that different issues engage different constellations of interests, everything's fine. As soon as you have a cleavage in a department, a crevasse, then every issue falls into the crevasse, and things just get very bad. So I absolutely knew at Manchester that the one thing to prevent was a cleavage, and I hoped while I was head of department here in Cambridge that was also the case. But I mean that was worked out. I mean, not just by happenstance. And I think it is really true of Girton that although from time to time the fellows divide themselves, and although they have to always overcome the sort of art-science divide simply because of the different kinds of demands made on people by the university, I think I can fairly say there are no divisions that split the community. So people work together very well, and as soon as and if people work together well, you can do anything. With goodwill. I mean, you can. I mean, whether people are critical or supportive of what you want to do, there's a way of working through issues. So just keeping caretaking, keeping things going, like household management, is actually very important. It's, these are little words for a task that is actually quite important.
I have so many more questions, but is there anything that you would really like me to ask you? Otherwise I'll ask you my last question.
Go on, you ask me the last question.
Well, one is, obviously, both you and I are just approaching our retirement. So I was going to ask you what you were planning to do. I know that you're planning not to plan to do anything particular, but is there anything you'd like to say about what you hope to do in the way of...
No, I still have till September.
to work.
I have various invitations and commitments ahead of me. But I've been saying, in answer to that question that people ask me quite often, I give an answer that's extremely unsatisfactory, which is that I want to go back over what I've been doing these last few years, because although I've carried on writing, I've not done any thinking, not in my view. And I'd really like to go back over what I've been doing and think what is there worth taking forward or not. So that's a very low-key aspiration, but that'll do for the moment.
And you carried out the injunction of Ray Bradbury, write first, think later. You've been writing first and thinking later. Well, I've got time just for one last little question, which is, in an article about Cambridge in a big book that came out recently, you used the phrase which the Vice-Chancellor likes, which is that Cambridge embodies the genius of scale.
That's right.
What did you mean by that?
Yes, I'm delighted at the way that it's been picked up. And
what does it mean? That everything is the kind of fractal idea that things are...
No, I simply mean that the university can go on growing larger while conserving small-scale associations in the colleges. But for as long as the colleges are the size they are sort of now, as it were, you add another college, you don't enlarge the colleges. And this structure is a brilliant structure for simultaneously being large and small at the same time. I mean, I can't think of a cleverer solution to to institutions to do with educating people.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Marilyn.